Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 212. And this time I'm going to talk about Motorhead's epic live album from 1981, No Sleep Til Hammersmith. And this is a contemporaneous first Canadian pressing, which sounds pretty good, although I hope my fellow Motorhead fans won't be offended if I say that sound fidelity isn't really the point. What to expect? Well, Motorhead are basically Motorhead. They have this lane in between a whole bunch of different kind of related genres, heavy metal, sort of biker, boogie rock, punk, but they've always resisted categorization. They're just their own thing, kind of like AC/DC, they're just their own thing. Despite eventually being influential in a whole bunch of American bands, they didn't chart in the States for many, many years. They were big in the UK. I only really came across this album back in 1981 because I was living in Canada with that sort of Commonwealth effect. But wherever you live, it's best to play this record in an altered state and to use a pair of speakers whose outer limits you're prepared to test. Well, we better start this discussion with Lemmy, who was born in 1945 in Stoke, UK, which explains a few things. He grew up in Wales. He got the nickname Lemmy at school, but doesn't really know how that happened. Living in North Wales as a teenager, he was self-taught in the guitar, and that's quite close to Liverpool. He actually saw the Beatles play at the Cavern Club when he was 16, went home, taught himself to play along to the whole of the Please Please Me album. Loved the Beatles way more than the Stones because despite their image, he knew what they were, which was basically working class guys who could mix it up if they had to. They came from a tough town. Didn't think much of the Stones, who were, probably quite rightly, characterized in the mid-60s as a bunch of middle class posers. He left school without many qualifications, but his heart was set on music. In the mid-60s, he was a rhythm guitarist, not a bass player, and his early bands included the Rainmakers, the Motown Sect, and an outfit called the Rockin' Vickers, who had a kind of wacky clergyman thing going on. I would just love to have been in that band. The Vickers toured a bit in Europe, but never really got off the ground, and in 1967, Lemmy leaves the band, moves down to London, and he ends up moving in with Noel Redding, who had just become the bass player for the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And for a while, Lemmy is a roadie for Jimi Hendrix. He spent the late 60s playing rhythm with a couple of psychedelic bands that didn't go anywhere, but in 71 he gets a big break because he joins the band Hawkwind, who were already well established. They were looking for another guitarist. He shows up to audition, but at this gig, which is happening around the same time, their bass player didn't show, all his gear's there, and so Lemmy steps in on bass. He'd never really played bass, at least not in a professional way before. He gets the gig, and they decide that because of the quality of his bass playing, they don't actually need to add a second guitarist after all. His bass playing ended up being quite distinctive, probably due to the fact that he played rhythm guitar before, because unlike most bass players in pop or jazz who either pluck or pick lines of individual notes, he would play double stops, like two notes at the same time, or chords, which gives his bass this character of being sort of fuller, broader sounding, often more percussive, and fills up the space in a band which a rhythm guitarist would often fill, like, say, Malcolm Young. He also sang for Hawkwind, including on their biggest hit, Silver Machine, which goes to number 3 in 1972. He then gets busted in the mid-70s in Ontario, just like Keith Richards, although unlike Keith Richards, he doesn't get to stay with the band. He's fired by Hawkwind. So at this point, he decides to form his own band, and he's going to name it after a song which he wrote for Hawkwind called, obviously, Motorhead. He wanted the band to be a power trio. He was modeling it kind of on the sound of the MC5. He said he wanted it to be so loud that they moved in next to you, your lawn would die. For an initial lineup, he drafted in a friend of his who was also playing with the Pink Fairies, a guy called Larry Willis, on guitar. He also played with a band called Shagrat. And on drums, a guy called Lucas Fox, who would go on to play with the punk band Warsaw Pact. Because Motorhead was, in a small sense, a bit of a supergroup coming together, they didn't have too much difficulty getting signed by United Artists, as it turned out. They go into the studio to cut some tracks fairly early on. Dave Edmunds of Rockpile, the guitarist, comes in as the producer. Those recordings don't really work out too well. They get shelved. Eventually they get released down the line. But what happens here is that Fox is basically unreliable. He's not showing up for the sessions, and he gets canned. And Lemmy reaches out to another friend, a guy called Phil Taylor, or the Filthy Animal. Lemmy then decides they need a second guitarist, and Phil says, I got a friend called Fast Eddie Clark. So Eddie Clark comes in. Wallace leaves and goes back to the Pink Fairies almost immediately. Whether he's put out by there being a second guitarist or not, it's not really clear. But in any event, by early 1976, the classic lineup of Motorhead is in place. Lemmy, Phil Taylor on drums, and Fast Eddie on guitar. They didn't win a lot of friends immediately. That year, they were actually voted the best worst band in the country. Taylor and Clark decide at some point they want to quit. Lemmy doesn't want them to quit. The compromise is they'll do a farewell show, so they get booked in to do a farewell show at their marquee. This is where fate steps in because a guy called Ted Carroll from Chiswick Records was there. He says, look, can we give you guys a couple of days recording time? Like your sound, can we do a single? Well, that single actually ends up with them recording basically both sides of a record, their debut record called Motorhead. That record is released in August 77. It gets to a fairly respectable number 43 in the UK charts. But then they have a whole bunch of issues with management, and they can't really keep the wheels on. And nothing really happens for about a year or so until they get signed to an outfit called Bronze Records. Bronze was a small label set up in the UK in the early 1970s, set up by people in the Uriah Heep camp, and The Damned, Hawkwind, and Girls' School were also amongst their talent roster. Once they're signed to Bronze, the first single that Motorhead releases is a cover of Louie Louie, which is awesome if you've never heard it. And this gets them on John Peel's Radio 1 show, it gets them on Top of the Pops, and now they really are on their way. 3 brilliant albums follow in the next couple of years. Overkill, which goes to number 24, Bomber, which goes to number 12, both of those in 79, and in the following year, the classic Ace of Spades. That album goes to number 4 in the UK, only number 201 in the States, and they were really having difficulty getting any kind of traction in the US. Didn't have much distribution there either. But in the UK, they were getting a really solid audience, made up of a mixture of bikers, punks, rockers, potheads, kind of a rainbow coalition of people who like their rock and roll, I guess, to have some balls. That fan base was built in part by relentless touring surrounding all of these recording dates, and to make this live album, a number of dates from a short UK tour in the spring of 1981 were selected. The players in this record are, of course, Lemmy, Clark, and Taylor. The producer is a guy called Vic Mail, whose previous production credits included The Who's Live at Leeds, although he's uncredited there, and he'd also been in the booth in the studio for Ace of Spades. The record is largely drawn from 1981 gigs on 3 consecutive nights in 2 different northern English cities. Queen's Hall in Leeds on March 28th and City Hall in Newcastle on March 29th and 30th. The only track on here which is not from those dates is Iron Horse, and that was recorded somewhere in Europe the previous year, 1980, though the band weren't quite sure where. They never actually played the Odeon in Hammersmith or anywhere in Hammersmith on that particular tour. The phrase "No Sleep Till Hammersmith" had been a running in joke for the band while they were touring. They liked the sound of it, so it became the title. This is only a single LP, not a double LP as was common for live albums back in the day. The band didn't have a set list long enough to fill a double LP, and this was actually a conscious choice because their whole show, as you can tell when you listen to this record, is all about high energy. They wanted to keep their energy levels up. They wanted to keep the fans' energy levels up, so they were never going to play for 3 or 4 hours. They kept it pretty tight. In its first week of release, the record hit number 1 in the UK. When it was released, the band were actually touring the US in support of Ozzy Osbourne in his very first Blizzard of Oz tour, and the fact the record was doing so well in England led some promoters to actually put Motorhead up top in the bill, which didn't please Ozzy. But strangely enough, this record never seriously charted in the States at the time. Side 1 starts with the timeless classic Ace of Spades, and as soon as you get the first few chords, this throaty roar arises from the crowd. It's an amazing performance, this particular recording, and it's totally driven by Lemmy's bass, which just has that incredible percussive sound. There's no letting up on the next song, Stay Clean. The pace continues. Metropolis offers a healthy dose of post-industrial anomie and nihilism with a wicked wah-wah solo by Clark. The Hammer is, no two ways about it, a song with a slightly aggressive theme. It also contains the all-world lyric, "I'm in your life, might be in your wife." The next track is Iron Horse, Born to Lose, which was the one recorded in Europe the previous year. Probably my second favorite on the record, actually, after Ace of Spades. This is basically an ode to bikes and bikers. Lemmy dedicates it to the Angels. Side 1 closes with No Class, which keeps the energy up and is basically a diss track about someone. The flip side kicks off with Overkill, and Taylor starts us off with just an avalanche of drumming. This is just a celebration of loud, fast rock and roll. We Are the Road Crew is next, which Lemmy dedicates to a fine body of men. The song rocks pretty hard, but it's basically a bit of a rock and roll poem about alcohol, promiscuity, red tape, hard work, and fighting. Capricorn is a bit of a thought-provoking riff on a solitary, resilient life, and the best thing about this is Clark's solo. Bomber, the other track from Leeds, and the inspiration for the stage set here, is basically about the parallels between the 3-piece Marshall amplified rock band and aerial bombardment. The final track is Motorhead, which is the kind of song that every band ought to have, in that it's a good, honest drug song. In this case, about the drug speed, the engine of a touring band. It was true for the Beatles, and it was true for Motorhead. On this record, 45 minutes goes by like 10. The pace never lets up, the themes are often autobiographical, they're very funny, and Motorhead absolutely nailed their claim to that lane in between hard rock and punk. This, of course, soon became the twin subcultures of speed metal and thrash metal, but even when they were established, Motorhead always stood apart. This record demands your absolute attention. It is a landmark of musical aggression. It's awesome, and I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.